Annabelle sat still, still as a glass statue in a classroom as chilly as unkindness. The clock on the wall measured out the silence with a soft tick, 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 and the air around her mouth frosted with the release of every cautious breath. She had dressed hastily, not in her school uniform, but in last year's dress, and it pinched her waist. As for her hair, she had not combed it at all, and unruly brown wisps had escaped from her braid, curling around the top of her head like a sort of rogue halo. Mrs. Brutankle stared down from the front of the room, keeping her distance as though Annabelle carried a germ. At last she spoke.
Miss Silvers, I realize this will come as a shock, but there's no helping it. As of this morning, the justices of the Shiversvale Commonwealth have locked your father up in Childerbridge Tower, dispossessing him of his entire fortune. You are as penniless as a stray mongrel.
She searched Annabelle's face, possibly looking for evidence of these tidings' brutality upon her spirit. But Annabelle neither collapsed her shoulders nor dropped her gaze. She stared back at Mrs. Brutankle, concentrating as much self into her expression as she could muster.
Did you hear what I said?
Annabelle didn't blink.
It isn't true. Mrs. Brutankle blinked a great deal, and she also sniffed. He was caught red-handed with secret documents, and with the Queen's brooch in his pocket. There can be no doubt of your father's guilt. You, child, must learn to feel and to wear your shame in your countenance. It should touch your face. It should bear down upon your shoulders. You have nothing, and you are nothing. A respectable lady has written and has proposed to take responsibility for you. Leave your uniforms and books. You'll have no further use for such things. Your educational career is over. Look forward to a future of poverty and ignorance.
Annabelle swallowed, and for the first time that morning, she dropped her gaze and felt her cheeks burn with an awful, scorching shamefulness. Mrs. Durham called an emergency meeting of the Ladies' Aviary Goodwill Society on account of the delicious gossip that had been stirring up the great city of Childerbridge. Good gossip was perishable, and Mrs. Durham wasn't the kind of lady to let spoil an entree of this quality. She held her tongue through tea service and kept silent during the initial small talk, which was unfortunately necessary, though tedious. I can't tell you what trouble I've been having keeping a servant to look after my pigeon deck, Mrs. Holmes complained. I've lost my third girl in 2 weeks. Poor dear, Mrs. Hathaway soothed, though she'd all but lost her hearing and had no idea what Mrs. Holmes had said. Mrs. Durham tutted. Iris, dear, nothing more about your pigeon-befouled roof. We have far more important matters to discuss today. You are aware, of course, of what happened at Shadwick Palace last week. I never read the newspapers, Hannah. They're too vulgar, said Mrs. Honey. Certainly. But a lady must come to the aid of her queen. The queen? Whatever ails her? The crime of the century, that's what. It isn't strictly corroborated, but there is a very strong rumor going around that the crown jewels are stolen. Mrs. Holmes, startled, dumping her tea in her lap. Oh, this is terrible! She dabbed her skirt with a table linen. Indeed. But who has done it? A perfectly tragic person, an entertainer, calls himself a magician. Not that man with the doves at the Millennium. Yes, exactly. I saw his show last season. He made an entire flock of doves completely disappear. It was astonishing. I wanted to call the Humane Society and make a complaint. Well, he couldn't make a diamond brooch disappear. They caught him with it in his coat pocket. Then they've recovered everything, all of the jewels.
Nothing but the brooch. And the magician maintains he's innocent, though his prints were found all over it. They arrested him on the spot, blustering all the while that he was set up, and indeed there seems to have been another person involved. But he's disappeared.
But who was the accomplice?
The Queen's own driver, if you can imagine, a man called Jacob Unwich. He has a beard as red as a fox, and his low-life friends call him Red Jake.
But the authorities must find him. They can't let him get away with such a crime.
The magician claims they'll never find him, because he was magically transported.
Transported?
Yes, over earth or underneath or some madness. Said it with a straight face. You can imagine the Queen's fright. The thief from her own staff. The palace must be in perfect turmoil.
I should say so, said Mrs. Holmes, dabbing her skirts.
They say, said Mrs. Hurst,
the magician had a daughter at school.
But she cannot remain at school, of course. She has no living kin, and no one will take the child of a national traitor.
Pitiful creature.
Indeed. Mrs. Holmes set the linen down and glanced up from her tea stain.
What do they call the girl?
Haven't the faintest.
But perhaps she's good at scrubbing. I should inquire.
The ladies around the tea table all drew a unified gasp.
Well, I've just got to get somebody, and she's been turned out of school.
She's unlikely to get anything better under the circumstances.
It was a brisk morning in December when the hands of the grandfather clock in Mrs. Holmes' foyer began winding widowshins. Irregular behavior for a clock of age and stature, but it had its reasons. Magic's influence will sometimes bring out the worst in even the most punctual timepieces. The house mistress lay abed upstairs, so the clock incident passed with little notice, but Annabelle was already awake, dressed, and huffing and puffing up the servants' staircase, with a 10-pound bag of birdseed slung over her shoulder. When she reached the top of the first staircase, she leaned against the banister for a breath. Then came a short hallway and another stone stairway, and a long hallway and yet another wooden stairway, and despite all that height and effort, the top was nothing like heaven. It was the beginning of a wretched job of work. The stairs opened into a roof garden, which was lovely, except for the pigeons. Mrs. Holmes fancied pigeons, and she commissioned a blacksmith to fashion her roof deck with an enormous birdcage, bigger than Annabelle's bedroom, bigger than 2 of her bedrooms put together. Its iron bars were ornate, curving around in charming swoops and curlicues, with cupids and angels hanging onto the bars like poor, falsely imprisoned jailbirds. Inside the cage, hundreds of pigeons perched upon the bars. Let that sink in for a moment. Not dozens of pigeons, no. Hundreds of pigeons in a cooing, preening mass of moult and beak. The cage was a perfect storm cloud of raining feather down. Pigeons swooped between swings, or pecked at gravel, or strutted around the floor of the cage. Feathers clung to Annabelle's freckled skin and stuck to her cotton apron. The feathers itched, and she gave herself rashes from scratching them. And she could never get the feathers out of her long brown braids, not if she spent a month of Sundays brushing them out of her hair. Peering up at the towering cage, she grasped the cold latch, which creaked on a rusty iron hinge, and with a jostle and a quick tug, it sprung open, and the pigeons crowded around her boots. It wasn't bad feeding the birds, no. It was what came after that she hated. When the pigeons had all stuffed themselves drowsy with birdseed, she had to scrub the entire roof deck on hand and knee until it shined. It was a vile job, scrubbing old and pigeon poop until her fingers bled, and the vinegar water stung the open sores of her hands. The instant she scrubbed the floor clean, a pigeon would let go another load of white and gray smack all over it. Reaching into the bag of Parsons' birdseed, she scattered a handful around the cage. In response, the pigeons sprang to life, fluttering their wings and stirring the air with thousands of feathers floating around as their wings unfolded. Their beaks opened in a chorus of, "Feed me, feed me, feed me." But they said it in pigeon, of course. Annabelle scattered several more large handfuls. Then she shut the latch and darted back downstairs. Now that they were fed, she had to get back to the kitchen to haul up the bucket of vinegar water, and quickly, so as to be done before Mrs. Holmes awakened and wanted to have her own breakfast. But as she rounded the bottom of the servants' staircase and burst through the kitchen door, she collided headlong into Mrs. Channing, the cook, whose weight threw her backward so hard she knocked her head against the doornail. Ouch!